It seems really trite to say if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it, but nothing illustrates that more than the history of policing.
Policing, in one form or another, has existed since colonial days. In the form of night watches, local sheriffs, and militias. But it wasn't until the 19th century that northern cities such as Boston created modern police departments as we would recognize them today. These northern departments were not the first example of a uniformed, publicly funded law enforcement institution in America.
By the time the northern colonies were afoot in the 17th century, the idea of keeping track of the most valuable asset in the United States, that is, enslaved Africans, animated much of what we'd recognize today as law enforcement.
In the 1700s, the South saw the rise of official, salaried slave patrols, whose task was to capture, control, and brutalize enslaved people.
The initial acts that empower slave patrols and militias were acts that basically empowered all white people to surveil and punish all black people.
These slave patrols were required to serve a tour of duty, usually up to a year. Individuals were compensated for their time, but they were also penalized if they did not show up for their required service.
All white people, including white children, were expected to enforce so-called slave codes. These laws were meant to prevent enslaved people from organizing or rebelling. It was against the law, for example, for enslaved people to leave their plantations, gather without a white person present, learn to read or write, or even defend themselves if attacked by a white person. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime.
The South immediately moves to exploit this loophole by passing a series of crime bills known as black codes, which essentially criminalize all forms of black freedom. They criminalize unemployment by adopting these very broad vagrancy laws that essentially criminalize any black person who can't prove that they're working. Any African American who challenges the terms of work, barters or brokers for a better deal, turns down a terrible offer, walks away from an abusive employer or a relationship with a landowner, by definition becomes a vagrant and by definition becomes a criminal. They could then be sold at sheriff's auction back to the very person who had just claimed that they were a criminal by virtue of not accepting a fair labor deal.
This practice of convict leasing earned enormous revenues for the states who lent out their prisoners, and huge profits for the companies using this prison labor in mining, railroads, and other industries. The new laws effectively re-enslaved those who had just gained their freedom and required new police to take over the former duties of the slave patrols.
When you have black people serving in political offices for the first time, when you have black landowners in abundance, when you have black professionals, there are Reconstruction era judges, the stakes are even higher for this everyday performance of black subservience to white domination. It is the police who will ultimately serve that function of reminding black people, in many cases, their lower status in society.
What we see is that general way of thinking about race and thinking about disorderly people never really changes. It's kind of woven into the DNA. But it's not just because individual police officers are racist. It's because the institution was literally created to make sure that wealthy and powerful people could extract labor.
Early police departments in the North had a similar goal to control labor, and were notoriously corrupt.
The police functioned as an expression of political elites and powerful, affluent people who essentially wanted poor people to stay in their segregated slum communities. Police often functioned as enforcers of political machines, functioned one step removed from gangs.
Police often worked in the service of business owners who were faced with growing unrest among their labor forces in the wake of mass European immigration and rapid industrialization.
One of the best examples of this is the Pennsylvania State Police. The institutions that precede the Pennsylvania State Police are actually private police forces which are owned by people who are running coal mines. And their job is explicitly to control the workers who are trying to unionize for rights.
The story of policing in the United States is the story of systems meant to protect and serve only a fraction of Americans. It is this history that many of today's activists point to when calling for the defunding or even the abolishment of police.
The cops not protecting us, we gotta protect us.
The ability to police crime or inequality or poverty or races or whatever was the social problem to be solved by law enforcement was always an act of political power and discretion. And it just so happens that African Americans have stood in that position for the longest of any other population.
What the history does is it allows us to decouple the idea of public safety from the idea of police. What actually protects women from rape and from sexual assault, right? What actually stops people in communities, both black and white, from killing each other? What kinds of things actually help people who are mentally ill? Are those things police? And I think very quickly, once you reflect on that, you realize the answer is no. We have to stop saying police are broken. We have to say police are working, and we need to create another institution to do public safety.